Even if you're not taking your case to trial and you're choosing to plead guilty, or if you went to trial and lost, it is crucial to have a good attorney by your side for the sentencing purposes in federal court. This next Seventh Circuit case that I'm about to describe perfectly illustrates why it's important to have an attorney, because in this case, the attorney did a good job in saving his client over 7 years of prison by objecting at the proper time to the pre-sentence report. United States v. Helding is a Seventh Circuit case where an informant tells Wisconsin police that Mr. Helding will be driving a vehicle from California to Wisconsin and will be carrying large amounts of narcotics. So the law enforcement get a warrant and they pull over the vehicle, and they do in fact find 143 kilograms of marijuana in the car. They then get a warrant to search Mr. Helding's apartment, where they find a scale that has methamphetamine residue, small amounts of marijuana, mostly for personal use, and a couple of handguns. Mr. Helding pleaded guilty to possession with intent to distribute marijuana and possession of firearms. His drug charges carried a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years, and his gun charges carried a mandatory minimum of 5 years. I already have a video describing how to avoid mandatory minimum sentences in federal court. I will link that video above so you'll be able to watch it. It's important to understand there's ways to get under the mandatory minimums, and sometimes people cannot based on their criminal history. Additionally, each defendant will always be exposed to a certain level under the sentencing guidelines. These are the sentencing guidelines. Every year, the Sentencing Commission puts out a book that tells the judge and the parties to the case how much time an individual should be sentenced to for each federal crime. Now, in the front here of the book, we have the sentencing table. In the table, there's ranges in months. Now, back in the day, these guidelines used to be mandatory, meaning the judge had to sentence the individual to that particular number of months. They're no longer mandatory. These guidelines are now advisory. So it's a starting point for the federal judge to look at, and then that judge can sentence an individual to more time or less time than the guidelines. It's important to know who your judge is, and you should ask your attorney what's the likelihood of the sentence that you're about to receive. Now, when we're talking about drug charges, the offense levels, which the higher the offense level, the more exposure you have, the more time you're going to serve in prison, are really based on the quantity of drugs and the type of the narcotics. So it's important to establish that amount early on with the prosecution, and then continue fighting to make sure that that amount does not change. Back to Mr. Helding, or any defendant, before he gets sentenced, probation office will come out and prepare what's called a Presentence Investigation Report. It is commonly known as PSR. Now, the probation officer will interview my client, and I'm present during that interview. And I hope that your attorney is also present there, because I get to control the conversation. I don't let the probation officers ask all the questions that they want. I control and I make sure that the only questions that are being answered are the ones that will help my client. Now, during this probation interview, the officer will ask my client about their criminal history, if I allow them, about the case itself, about personal information about my client, his medical history, his employment history, any familial ties, and so on. Now, once that probation report is complete, the probation officer will recommend a certain sentence. So the probation officer will also look at the guidelines and calculate the range and then they'll recommend the actual amount of months. So at the end of the day, we're going to have three recommendations, one by the defense, one by prosecution, and one from the probation office. Now, in Mr. Helding's case, the probation officer calculates the guidelines completely different than both of the parties. While the prosecution and the defense said that Mr. Helding is responsible for 143 kilograms of marijuana that was found in his car and later in his home, the probation officer says that Mr. Helding should be held responsible for all the transactions in the conspiracy. Now, under the guidelines, it tells you that certain transactions are relevant for the sentencing purpose, meaning that we can look at the conspiracy, and if other individuals in that conspiracy distributed drugs and it was in furtherance of your common goal or conspiracy, then an individual who's being charged can be responsible for all of those other types of narcotics and quantities of narcotics. So of course, when you add all of that up, his guidelines skyrocket. Now, Mr. Helding's case becomes very interesting because the probation officer doesn't just come up with these drug quantities. What they do is they interviewed other informants, about a handful of individuals, and they asked them how much did Mr. Helding distribute to them and to other individuals. All of those people have stated some amount. The probation officer added that amount up, and it was much higher than 143 kilograms of marijuana. The informants in Mr. Helding's case tell the probation officer that Mr. Helding was distributing methamphetamine. Anytime we're dealing with different types of narcotics, we have to convert the other types of narcotics to marijuana. So at the end of the day, we're going to have one number that will be converted, and it's going to be an equivalency number in marijuana. So in this situation, the additional methamphetamine that Mr. Helding supposedly distributed will be converted to methamphetamine. And now looking at the guidelines, if he was responsible for the initial 143 kilograms of marijuana that was seized from him at the vehicle stop and later from his house, then he'd be at level 26, 120 to 150 months in prison. Now, when the probation officer says that he's now responsible for all these other transactions, he's responsible for 4,679 kilograms of marijuana, which is nearly 5,000 kilograms of marijuana. He's going to be at level 32, 210 to 262 months in federal prison. In other words, his guidelines jumped over 7 years because of this additional information. His attorney rightfully objects, and he says that this information is not reliable. There is nothing in the probation report that explains where this information comes from other than these informants. We don't know anything about the informants. Are they reliable? Have they worked with law enforcement before? What are their everyday jobs? Do they have criminal history? What their motive is for saying this? Now, when Mr. Helding goes to sentencing, the district judge overrules the objection and says that because the pre-sentence report is detailed enough, it doesn't matter anymore if these people are reliable. He says by the virtue of the fact that there's enough information, it seems like they are reliable. So he gets sentenced according to the pre-sentence report, and then we go to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, where Mr. Helding renews his objection. The 7th Circuit says that when the judge looks at the PSR, he can assume that the information contained in that PSR is reliable. However, when the defendant, such as Mr. Helding, objects to the PSR, certain steps must be taken to ensure that the information is reliable. The Seventh Circuit doesn't tell us what those steps must be. For example, maybe the prosecution can come in and explain how that information was corroborated. Or maybe the district court should ask the informants to actually come in and testify before the court. Whatever they decide to do, the district court must do something when the defendant objects. So good job to the defense attorney in this case for making that objection, because now the Seventh Circuit reverses the sentence and sends it back to the district court, where this individual must be resentenced under the lower guidelines. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button so next time I post, you'll be first to know.